Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Daniel Davis, your host, and today we've got an interesting show for you. $700 billion was voted into Congress to help bail out what everybody seems to think is the Wall Street situation here. Well, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a spokesman for the LaRouche Political Action Committee, and we're here to talk about what this is all about and is there a plan B. Our guest today has been serving this particular organization, which goes back to about 1972. So when it comes to understanding what goes on in the political arena, especially when it comes to economics, this is one of those people that will be able to maybe clear the air better than what we're hearing on the news today. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is Harley Schlanger, and thank you for joining us here on the program today, Harley.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Now, you know what was interesting about this whole bailout situation is the fact that it just seemed to all of a sudden happen. And to me, from my understanding of economics, things like this usually take time and can usually be caught. So what happened here?
Well, your perception is absolutely right. It didn't just happen. We've had a crisis which has been developing over the last, going back to last July 2007, where you had a freezing up of the credit internationally. That is, banks stopped trading with each other their financial paper. And what that means is that there was no liquidity in the system. Now, this was blamed on the so-called subprime crisis. But what Mr. LaRouche pointed out several years ago is the subprime crisis was actually a bailout for the banking system. That is, Greenspan, after the collapse of the Y2K bubble, you remember that, the dot-com bubble?
Mm-hmm.
Greenspan seems to like bubbles. And so what he said is, instead of fixing the problems with the economy, let's create a new bubble by channeling funds through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So they were used like a giant piggy bank to channel U.S. funds to mortgage lenders and banks by buying up the outstanding mortgages and mortgage-backed securities to provide liquidity to banks. And then banks would go out and make increasingly ridiculous loans to people who couldn't afford them to keep the money flowing in the system. Now, at a certain point, it was inevitable that this bubble would pop, that people could no longer continue to pay the loans as the adjustable rate mortgages kicked in at a higher level. And also, the appreciation of home values had to reach a limit at some point. I mean, how much you buy a house in 1990 for $100,000 and you're told in 2003 it's now worth $500,000. It's the same house, maybe a lot of wear and tear on it. Why is it so much more valuable? And yet people refinance their home to get the cash, the extra money. They were told their house is a piggy bank. And especially boomers fell for this. Here's your retirement. Live off the equity in your house. And so the whole society went crazy into the speculative bubble. And so when it crashed, the banks at a certain point could no longer pass their bad paper back and forth. Now, this really occurred in July 2007. And you may remember shortly after that, Bear Stearns had two funds that on paper were worth $8 billion that they shut down at zero overnight. By the way, the two Bear Stearns people who ran those funds are now indicted and facing a long prison term. But that was $8 billion in assets that were listed in 401ks and other kinds of money market funds that disappeared overnight. So we called for some immediate action, but nothing was done. Then you may remember in the spring, all of a sudden the Dodd-Frank bill, Senator Dodd from Connecticut and Barney Frank from Massachusetts, we're going to solve the problem with Fannie and Freddie. And next thing you know, they get a bill passed, and then we're starting a series of what we jokingly refer to as weekends at Bernanke's, where you have Bernanke and Paulson, the head of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Secretary, trying to pump life into dead financial institutions. Seems like every Sunday they would be staying up till all hours of the night to figure out what to do with Lehman Brothers, what to do with AIG, what to do with Wachovia and Washington Mutual, and on and on and on. And finally, Paulson said, look, we need about $700 billion, a number I'm told he picked out of thin air. He wanted something big enough to convince people they were serious, but not too big to completely freak people out. And so we ended up with this bailout package. Now, probably a lot of your listeners don't know that Paulson said in congressional testimony that $100 billion to $200 billion of this will go to European banks. Now, that's because the European banks and the U.S. banks are totally intertwined when it comes to mortgage-backed securities and derivatives and credit swaps and things of that nature. And we've seen in the last week, last Friday, 4 European banks collapsed. And by Monday, all the European governments are bailing out their banking system. So this is a global crash. It's really been underway for about 30 years because we've had a shift to the so-called post-industrial society. But it's hit with a vengeance during the term of President Bush. And this President Bush has no clue what to do with it. And Paulson is acting to save Wall Street.
Now, it's interesting because this is one of those situations during the Bush administration in which there seems to be this rush to do something that you would think takes time to think it through. Should we be doing this? The first action I wanted to speak of was, this rush to go to the war in Iraq. And, now we're spending something, as I understand, $2 billion a day just to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And this rush to get there. And then all of a sudden when this came on the horizon, to a lot of people, the perception is about a month ago, this just all of a sudden was there, and there was this rush to solve this thing. Bush had the pen in hand saying, I can't wait, let's get this bill passed. And I think a lot of people had applauded Congress for digging in its heels because for the first time it sounded like within this administration, we feel that the people have something to say about this, but then it only took an extra week before it was passed anyway. Now, what I'd like to ask you, Harley, is from everything the media has been portraying about this, what is it that we are not hearing?
Well, you're absolutely right again in what you just laid out because, I'm wondering, are they looking for weapons of mass destruction in Wachovia bank vaults?
Yeah.
This idea that we have to do it now. The whole system will collapse Monday if we don't do it. And then look what happened. Last Monday, members of the House of Representatives were reporting 99-1 the calls against the bailout. In fact, I know Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, she said she received 39,000 calls, letters, and emails, and less than 400 supported the bill. So the people smelled a rat, you might say. And the Congress, essentially, the House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans, reacted against it. Now, Republicans had their own view. They think it's too much government. Democrats were partly in contested districts. They didn't want to be seen as giving a bailout to Wall Street. So that afternoon, the Dow Jones collapsed. It went down 777 points. And so Bush and Paulson came right back and said, you see, the whole system's going to collapse if you don't vote this bill through. Mm-hmm. And the Senate went ahead, and they added another $100 billion. Then it went back to the House. And even then, it didn't look like it would pass the House. And what Bush and Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, supposedly a liberal Democrat who's carrying water for the Bush administration, they told Democratic congressmen that if this bill fails and the banking system collapses, the president is prepared to send out troops into the streets of the United States to keep order. Now, why are they saying that? There's an element of truth to their concern that there'll be social unrest. Because if this banking crash continues and the liquidity crunch continues, it's very clear that we may see a situation within days or weeks where certain parts of the country will not have food delivered to grocery store shelves, will not have gasoline at the service stations. There are already parts of the Southeast where, because of the lack of credit in southeastern banks, they don't have gasoline. It's not just the Hurricane Ike, it was the credit problem. So under those circumstances, this threat of martial law to protect the country scared some people. I know Congressman Brad Sherman from California addressed this when he spoke before the House, and he said, I don't believe it, and therefore I'm still voting against it. Now, you also had what I consider the most, I guess you could say, dangerous part of this. Both Senator McCain and Senator Obama, the Democrat and Republican candidates for president, backed the bailout. And in fact, Obama called the Black Caucus members in the House of Representatives personally and told them, look, I'm on the line for this thing. I want you to back it. If it doesn't work, we'll fix it when I get into the White House. And I don't think that's the kind of politicking. That, to me, the Bill Ayers question and the Keating Five are minor issues. Can we trust two candidates, both of whom are trying to distance themselves from Bush, who come to the rescue of the president under threat of a banking collapse?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that raises the question, well, is there an alternative? Did we have to rush into this? So I think these are the right questions to ask, and I think the American people are scratching their heads, especially after what we saw in the markets yesterday, that we're not out of this, and this bailout will not solve it.
You know, I find it interesting, too, Harley. Through the course of our show over the last 5 years, one of the elements that we share is we talk about, well, we really don't consider retirement to be even part of the dictionary anymore because more and more people just simply aren't doing that, but they are investing money, so there is that potential to have that time off when they need it in their later years. Now, what I find interesting about this bailout, and I think where it really punches, as they keep saying in the news, Main Street, is here are working class people that invest their money for that long-term situation. They'll be able to retire, if you will. And so the perception is they see these fat cats, so to speak, and this even includes our president himself. I don't see how this would affect those people at all because they've already got all the money on the planet that they'll ever need, but they yet talk to us like we're stupid children, and people know better than this, but yet they're still doing what they did anyway. So again, I was kind of curious, what haven't we been hearing in the media that we should be understanding?
Well, let me just go through then what caused this crisis in the broader sense, because that's what you're not hearing. You're beginning to hear people talk about deregulation. Mm-hmm. Now, we used to have a banking system that worked very well in this country. There was established under law something called the Glass-Steagall Bill, which was passed during the last huge banking crisis in this country, namely the winter of 1932-1933. When Franklin Roosevelt walked into the White House in March 1933, more than 20 states had shut down the banks in their states because they had what we would call today a credit crisis. That is, that there were runs on the bank. You know the famous scene from It's a Wonderful Life where they see a run on the bank? That was going on in state after state. The banks routinely never have your deposits and your savings and your CDs totally just sitting there in the bank because they use it to loan out.
Right.
And so if everyone demands their money at a certain point in time, they don't have it. But you have trust and confidence that the bank has liquid investments that if they need to, they can get your money. Well, what Roosevelt did was he realized that because of the collapse of the stock market and the speculative nature of the Coolidge-Hoover years, the banking system itself was filled with bad paper. And they were taking the people's savings and deposits to cover the bad debt. So Roosevelt had a banking bill, the Glass-Steagall Bill, which did two things. It guaranteed that the government would provide liquidity to local, state, and federally chartered banks so the banks could stay open. That is, if people insisted on getting their deposits, the federal government would put the money in there. But it then put up a firewall which said we're not going to pay out money to these banks to use it to cover over their bad debts. And that worked. And then Glass-Steagall had a second provision to separate by law what the function of savings and loans, which would be mortgage institutions, from commercial banks, which would be checking and savings and local businesses and city and county government, from investment banks, which would buy and sell stocks. And that differentiation, and also a fourth category, was insurance companies. That differentiation lasted until 1980. And especially at the end of World War II, through the late 60s, we had an annual physical growth of the U.S. economy that was unprecedented in world history. We also rebuilt Japan and Germany. Now, the problem was that when money started flowing out of the United States, In 1971, Richard Nixon panicked and canceled the system that was set up at the end of World War II, the global financial system called the Bretton Woods system, which had been a gold reserve system and a fixed exchange rate system. And if I'm throwing out too much, please interrupt me, because these are absolutely important things that people should know.
Well, it's important that you're talking about this because of the evolution of how we came to have the foreign currency tradings and being able to balance and stabilize both our domestic as well as our foreign currencies.
Well, what Roosevelt understood was something that no one teaches anymore in the universities. It's called physical economy. It's that you have to have investments in the future that will produce a product, a sellable product, a usable product to back up money. That is, ultimately, if you have a gold reserve system, you know there's gold behind it. If you get off a gold reserve system, as we did in 1971, you have to have something physical that's backing your currency, not on a one-to-one basis. But at least know that if you're borrowing money, it's a good thing to borrow money if you're going to build a new steel plant or upgrade power and water management. It's not a good thing if you're borrowing money to cover bad debts. And this goes back to something Roosevelt understood that comes from the founding of this country. The first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, had a statement that Paulson should have emblazoned on his desk, which is never assume a debt without the means to extinguish it. In other words, it's okay for government to borrow to create debt for the future, provided that credit that they're creating is going into something that will produce new wealth. If you're borrowing to pay old debt, and this is where any family knows this, if you owe on a mortgage and credit cards and you have huge debt and you lose your job and you can't cover it, the last thing you want to do is borrow more money. Mm-hmm. So the problem was that once we deregulated banking, it meant that now commercial banks could sell mortgages. They could buy and sell stocks. And not only that, but with a global deregulated system, they could create new financial instruments, which Greenspan, the former Fed secretary, loved. He called these financial innovations. Instruments called derivatives. That is, pieces of paper that banks would buy and sell to each other that were derived from something of value, but in themselves had no value. Something called a credit swap derivative, for example, or interest rate derivatives, where you're betting on whether the interest rates will go up or down. You're betting on whether the price of soybeans will go up or down. You're not placing an order for soybean futures. You're betting on what the price of those futures will be at the end. And so this is what LaRouche called a casino economy. Now, the final step in this was 1999, the Graham-Bliley, there's a third person involved, Act, which repealed Glass-Steagall completely. And so since 1999, we've had no regulation. We've had everything over the counter, which means no one knows what they're buying and selling. And all of it was based on the income stream from mortgages, because if you have trillions of dollars of leverage, you've got to have some amount of money coming in. But what happens when you start having defaults? As the income stream dries up or is cut back, then the question of the leverage is called into being. And that's what's happened with a vengeance in the last year. And so we've seen Bear Stearns go out of business. Merrill Lynch have to be taken over. Lehman Brothers go out of business. American International Group, the AIG, is only in existence because of an $85 billion bridge loan. And what are we guaranteeing with that $85 billion? Well over $2 trillion of derivative debt, most of which is held by European banks. So we have a global system which is filled with hot air. And what we should do is freeze the hot air, let the bubble collapse. And if you freeze it and protect the banks in the meantime by making sure there's credit going to things that are needed, like cities can pay their employees, like businesses can pay their employees, that Social Security checks that are deposited into accounts will be good. You protect that element of banking, but you freeze the bad debt and let that reprice over time. That's plan B. That's Lyndon LaRouche's proposal.
Mm-hmm. You know what I find interesting, Harley, and I think that the perception about this from a lot of people is one of tremendous aggravation, and they seem to play up in the news media. For instance, the concern that there are a lot of Wall Street executives that are going to get a piece of the action, so let's be sure that in this bailout plan that doesn't happen. And there's just this big concern that the money's going to go in a direction other than, as it seems like what you're suggesting is, in the right direction to really solidify more of a base, as opposed to, even as Obama had said during his campaign, the idea we're going to just put this money to the top, let it trickle down, and then the economy is just all of a sudden going to get better. It's like building a house where you start with a roof. And it sounds to me like under the LaRouche Plan B, what you have been working on here is something that certainly works on the infrastructure itself and holds that solid so the rest of it can fill itself in. Describe for our listeners how this works.
Well, let me just address the question of executive compensation for a moment, because that's the real populist hot button.
And that's the point. It seems to me that in the news they use these as distractions instead of just saying, this is a real truth that we really should be concerned with.
I mean, we're not bankrupt because CEOs are getting so much money. I don't think they should get so much money. I think that's a scam. But that's not the reason we're bankrupt. Mm-hmm. Now, if you use LaRouche's Plan B and put these firms through bankruptcy reorganization instead of bailing them out, they won't get the compensation. Because a company that goes into bankruptcy, the first thing they do is they cut the wages of their highest-priced employees. Mm-hmm. So, by court order. So we have this mechanism that Roosevelt used that's part of LaRouche's Plan B, which is you take a company like Lehman Brothers. It is the right thing to do to put them through bankruptcy reorganization. But if the court does it properly, then Fold, the CEO, is not going to get his bonus this year. It's going to go back to pay the people who lost money by court order. So you're right on that is a distraction, because here's the real problem. The reason we're in trouble is that we've been outsourcing our industry. We've been cutting way back on infrastructure development. We've been saving money in the short term, which unfortunately has been going to this insane war and now to a bailout, and not investing in those things which will increase our productivity in the future. Now, what Franklin Roosevelt did to get us out of the Depression is he created a series of authorities like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Grand Coulee Dam, the Hoover Dam, the St. Lawrence Seaway Project, where the government made credit available and then sold bonds to private individuals to hire companies to carry out infrastructure projects which were absolutely essential for the nation. For example, the TVA, instead of having the Tennessee River flood every year, you controlled it. We set up hydroelectric dams, a whole series of them, which provided power. The lack of flooding meant that the land there, which was valuable land, could be used for farming. The extra electricity meant they could set up projects such as the fertilizer project in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, which did advanced research in fertilizer, which increased the productivity of farms all over the nation. So with those kinds of projects, you take unemployed people, and our real unemployment rate, not the phony government statistic, but the real unemployment rate today, if you count the people who no longer are looking for jobs or are working part-time, is closer to 12 to 15%. Right. You put people back to work. You give young people coming out of college an opportunity to work on power plants and water management, major irrigation systems, projects like the flood control in the upper Mississippi Basin or New Orleans. Rebuild the bridges. About 40% of the bridges in this country are structurally unsound. You give people jobs that pay them decent wages so that they'll not only be able to become consumers, but they'll pay taxes. That's how you build yourself out of a collapse. Right. Now instead, we're paying the banks that blew all this money, that created this Ponzi scheme. We're financing their Ponzi scheme. You know, it's as though casinos were losing money and we bail out the casinos. So this is the absolutely wrong approach. But the reason we have this is that this country bought into the free trade policy, the deregulation policy that's part of globalization, which said our future prosperity depends on cheap labor and cheap raw materials from poor countries. And Americans will go to work in financial services, computer-related technologies, and so on. That's a losing proposition. The idea that free trade is something new based on the modern speed of computers and transferring money is a complete fraud. Free trade is the old imperial system that we founded our nation by going to war against it. The idea of free trade is that whoever controls the terms of trade gets their products for free from the poorer nations that can't compete. And the idea that Americans can somehow live by shopping at Walmart, buying the cheap goods produced by coolie labor in Guatemala and Thailand, is an absurd paradigm. But we bought into it. Americans bought into it because as long as we had credit cards, as long as we had the dot-com bubble, as long as we had the housing bubble, we had the appearance of prosperity. That's why people like Paulson and Bush and McCain could say up until 3 weeks ago, the fundamentals of the economy are strong. It's because the money supply was still flowing. Once they could no longer move the money, all of a sudden they find that it's not strong, that we're on the verge of going off a cliff and we need $1 trillion bailout.
Right. Now, Harley, it's interesting to think that here you have this $700 billion bailout. They seem to have only one direction, according to the perception of what we're being fed in the media. And here you have this Plan B, and this is what's interesting is anybody listening on Capitol Hill?
Well, here's the interesting thing on that. Last August 2007, after LaRouche did a webcast in July 2007 where he said the system's finished. And people said, there's LaRouche, he's always saying that. But as the Bear Stearns Fund collapsed, as the reports on the subprime markets collapsing came out, LaRouche made a proposal for the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act, which was modeled on Roosevelt's plan. And it was passed by city councils in over 100 cities, including cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Providence, Rhode Island. It was passed in 5 or 6 state legislatures. What I mean is they voted to have the Congress endorse this as legislation. And we had response from congressmen all over the country. They were interested in it. And then Nancy Pelosi came out with Barney Frank, and she said, we're not going to have this FDR legislation. We're going to have Barney Frank and Chris Dodd draft a bill. And so for 6 months, everything was put on hold as Frank and Dodd put together a bill. Now, one of the swindles that no one was told about until after the bill passed, and it finally appeared in the Washington Post 1 week after the bill passed, who do you think wrote the Dodd-Frank bill? It was Credit Suisse and Bank of America lobbyists. So it was written, and Bank of America has a special interest in this because they swallowed Countrywide, and they're hemorrhaging red ink over Countrywide. So the banks came up with a bailout plan. And then as the thing started unraveling at an increasing speed through July, August, and September, we saw Paulson and others come forward with this new bailout bill. Now, as a result, the Congress was stampeded into this, and Paulson, in fact, was asked, is there a Plan B? And he said, no, there is no Plan B. Now, the other side of LaRouche's policy is to go back to the Bretton Woods system of Franklin Roosevelt. And last Sunday, just 2 days ago, on Russian national television, their equivalent of CBS's 60 Minutes program had a 20-minute feature on Lyndon LaRouche's call for a new monetary system. In the Italian parliament, there's a bill calling for the European Union to initiate a proposal to adopt a new Bretton Woods. President Sarkozy of France is now talking about a new Bretton Woods. The Chinese government today in the People's Daily had a long article about how the bailout plan won't work. It's going to devalue the dollar. There's going to be hyperinflation. There is an alternative associated with economist Lyndon LaRouche. So all over the world, you have governments saying, why doesn't the United States go back to what worked in the last depression? the FDR plan. And in this country, I can tell you I've been extremely busy on radio programs from coast to coast. But how about CNN, Fox, MSNBC, the New York Times? They won't touch LaRouche because they're committed to globalization. They're committed to the high salaries that their corporate executives get from globalized economy. So I think what we're facing in the United States is a need for the American people to break out of this. And what I'd like to do is give a phone number for people to call so we can send them a short pamphlet we put together on the bailout, which explains what's wrong with it, how it happened, and what we can do, what this plan B is. So if people would like to get this, and you mentioned you heard it on the Beyond 50 radio program, we'll send you a free copy. Call us at 800-922-2907. That's 800-922-2907.
I find it interesting, just in wrapping things up here, is that you take a look at what you have just presented that to me makes a lot of sense. And I think it does. It sounds like it makes sense to people all over the world that are looking at the United States and saying, well, what you're doing seems illogical. In fact, it almost borders
and
on
dangerous.
Stupid is what it borders on.
Yeah.
And it seems that in this administration, and it really, I don't like to take a position to pick on somebody, but you take a look at choices that have been made through the administration, and as you said, going back even 30 years, and you say, well, this makes so much sense. Why are you going this direction? Regardless of these lobbyists coming in and pressuring you and your own motivations. And you pull back and you think of how the American people take a look at this and they go, it almost feels like no matter what we do, these people are going to go ahead and do stupid things anyway. What difference does it make what we'll do? And as you said earlier in the show, with this election with Senator John McCain and Senator Barack Obama, is this is also a dangerous situation for these two men. So now we have two people that we're going to elect one into office, and things just don't sound like they'll get any better regardless of who gets in there. But here's a plan B, but we're just going to go ahead and scrap that, even though the rest of the world and many people who listen to this think it's the right thing to do. What then can we do to get this stupidity sort of to stop?
Well, in defense of President Bush, which I rarely do, he doesn't have the mental capacity to figure this out. He has a set of convictions, and he's going to hold to those convictions stubbornly, even if it means the world goes to hell.
Right.
So, and personally, I think he has the look of him as someone who can't wait to be in Crawford, Texas, chopping wood on his Hollywood set there. So the danger we have is someone like Dick Cheney, who may be willing to start a war with Iran to blame the collapse on that and postpone the election. So we shouldn't eliminate the possibility. Well, look, there's discussion today. The Foreign Minister of France, Kouchner, said that he just got word that Israel is getting a go-ahead from the United States to bomb Iran before Bush and Cheney leave office. So, there are these kinds of dangerous things in the works. The problem you have with Obama and McCain is an ideological deregulator. He's committed to that. What most Americans don't know is so is Obama. Obama's economics comes from the University of Chicago. Read his book, the Audacity of Hope. He says right in the beginning, and he says it throughout the book, I'm a free trader. Well, free trade has just been discredited. The question is, could McCain or Obama switch, or should we have to depend on them? What I think LaRouche is saying is that this is the time where the American people have to come back on the stage of history. We have to scare the hell out of the congressman. If your congressman voted for this bill, you should be at his next town meeting, because most of them are up, every member of the House is up for re-election, and find out why he did it, and make it clear to him that you don't like it, that you don't like bailing out foreign banks and Wall Street when they're taking money away from Pell Grants and highway construction and hospitals and Medicaid and Medicare.
The people
and the schools. The people in this country are going to pay for this because the interest on the $700 billion is going to be in the budget next year. And the interest and the principal of our debt, we're now officially $11 trillion in debt. And technically, the Congressional Budget Office said the takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac added $5.4 trillion more. So we're over $16.25 trillion in debt. Now, you add the costs of Afghanistan and Iraq to the increased costs for interest and principal payments on the debt, where's that going to come out of? Both Obama and McCain are saying, well, we can't do the programs we wanted to do. Well, what do they mean? Forget national health care if Obama's in. Forget improvement to the Medicare and Medicaid system and prescription drugs and, as you say, education. So we're going to pay for it immediately. And many of the states in this country can't afford to pay their side of Medicare and Medicaid, as in the case of California, where Schwarzenegger, who's destroyed the state, is now going for he said, well, $700 billion, can't you give $7 billion to California?
So I found that funny, that happened about a week and a half later. It's like, so what other state's going to come up and say, well, wait a minute, we need money too?
Massachusetts saw Schwarzenegger do it, and Deval Patrick said, me too. So, there's something like 37 states that are having trouble meeting their budget requirements. So we're in a completely terrible situation. Now, we can either sit back and say, let's hope someone will solve it, or, and especially boomers who came through the 60s, where we saw that as imperfectly as the movements we were involved in, especially the anti-war movement, had its problems, but we saw the effectiveness of mobilizing the population. And the best example of that was what Dr. King did in the SCLC in the civil rights fight. You go to the people who are the ones who are going to be hammered by this, and you say, look, we need to know what to do and then go out and fight for it. And I would urge people to go on our website, LaRouchePAC.com. Don't take my word for it. Study it. Figure it out for yourself. It's not that difficult.
I actually think, Harley, that's one of the big reasons that America has gotten to the state that they're in, that we've become hypnotized by getting our information through news and sound bites instead of actually looking into the matter deeper. Because if you talk to anybody about this, that's about as superficial as the conversation gets.
Well, Daniel, let's go one step further. Between American Idol, topless bars, and major sports, and then you throw in drugs and booze, we have a population that's entertaining itself, not so different from the Roman bread and circuses, only instead of Roman bread, we now have focaccia and all kinds of other fancy breads. But we're sitting back assuming that we've got it made in the shade. And that we're so smart we could never have a global financial collapse. We're actually the best analogy is not 1929 to 32, but the collapse of the House of Bardi in 1435 and 36, which led to the Dark Age, in which the population of Europe, the standard of living fell so badly that the bubonic plague came and wiped out 1/3 of the population of Europe. Now you think about the deadly diseases that have evolved in the poor areas of Africa and parts of South America and Asia. And you think about what happens when people can't afford food, when people can't afford to heat their homes in the winter or cool them in the summer. We're facing a potential catastrophe of global proportions far more dramatic than anybody can imagine. And under these circumstances, if you're not willing to shut off your damn television and do some studying, try and read through some serious articles. You can find them on various websites, not just ours. But I think we're unique in the Plan B we offer. I think this is a time where the American people either mobilize or lose the great experiment that our country has been for well over 200 years.
Very well said. I'll tell you, it's absolutely true, because it's easy to sit and point fingers and say, well, my side's right and your side is wrong. But the bottom line is we're still all in this together, You could both be in a pot of boiling water and you're saying, well, it's because of you that I'm in this. But in the meantime, you're in it. And as you said, it's time for all of us to come together and to start taking back the control of the government to where it begins to serve us instead of taking advantage of us. Go ahead and give us that website again where people can find out. And we hope that a lot of our listeners tend to, as they do, take what we share and take it to the next step, of responsibility and finding out, more about this so that they can take intelligent action?
Well, the website is LaRouchePAC.com. That's LaRouchePAC.com. And one of the things I would encourage people to look at is we have a video made by members of the LaRouche Youth Movement, people in their early 20s, called 1932. And it discusses the period of U.S. history between 1860 and 1932, when twice, with Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, we had presidents who had to return the nation back to the principles of the Founding Fathers in terms of physical economy, against speculation and against Wall Street, to save the nation. And the lessons from that are very clear for today. The other thing, if you call our number here in my office in Houston, we'll send you a pamphlet called Tantamount to Treason, which goes through step by step how we got into this crisis and then offers the Plan B solution. So that's 800-922-2907.
Now, just one quick question before we go, Harley. Is it possible to turn this around from where we're at now?
Well, only if people take some action. If you wait for the Congress to do it, the Congress is bombarded by money from lobbyists. They're up for re-election. They're all terrified. They're scared little bunnies. You mention to a congressman, if you don't vote for this, there's going to be riots in the streets and National Guard sent in, and they say, okay, where do I sign? We've got to make them more frightened of the people than they are of Wall Street. But the real point here is that before you go out and demonstrate, before you stand around the water cooler yelling at everybody, make sure you know what's right. We have a history in this country where we've gone through these kinds of periods before, where we've had the Roaring 20s, we had the wildcat banking of the Andrew Jackson period, where we shut down the function of the national government and let the speculators run wild. And it nearly destroyed the country every single time it happened. And fortunately, we had leaders like Lincoln and like Franklin Roosevelt, and actually John Kennedy was moving toward making some changes in this direction when he was killed. We had leaders who emerged, and the people moved with them. We don't have those leaders right now. I don't see anybody in the Congress or on the presidential candidates who actually get it. And so more than ever, it's going to have to come from a movement of the people. So you can't sit back and say, who's coming in on a white horse this time? You're going to have to do it. And talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends. For those who remember the 60s, it's actually a lot of fun to do political organizing because you're testing your ideas against reality. And LaRouche's ideas have withstood the test of reality. Every other economic forecaster has been discredited by the events that they said would never happen.
I'll tell you, it's interesting times that we're in, and I appreciate you taking the time to share with us today, what is or has been going on and what the real possible solutions are that are much different from what we're seeing. So again, it's all about, we like to bring these up just to tell people, there are ways to look into this matter deeper, and the responsibility does lay on your shoulders, because at the end of the day, it was your lack of action or inaction that this can continue to perpetuate. And Harley Schlanger, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us here on the program today.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you.
You bet, very much. And again, you just have to get involved, and that's what it is, and also find out what it is you're getting involved with. I'm Daniel Davis. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit our website at beyond50radio.com, where we'll have more about this and the websites and how you can find out more about getting involved. And again, quit waiting for somebody to, throw in a stick to pull you out of the quicksand. You sort of help get yourself there just by not taking any action at all. So simply do that. And again, thank you for joining us here on the program, and to the listeners out there, and also our guest, Harley Schlanger. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.